Hi, I'm Hannah Nepilova, an integrative counsellor, and welcome to Therapy Chats, the podcast where I talk to specialists from different fields of mental health. My guest today is Anna Honeysett, a UK-based counsellor and psychotherapist with over 18 years of experience, 8 of those running her own private practice, Honeysett Counselling, in Ashford, Kent. Alongside lecturing and supervising at the University of East London, she specialises in working with individuals across all ages with a notable focus on addiction, addressing substance misuse, gambling, codependency, and even behavioural addictions, and has spent 5 years at an addiction centre earlier in her career. Additionally, Anna is the author of How to Set Up a Successful Counselling Practice, a practical step-by-step guide for aspiring private practitioners, offering checklists, notes pages, and insights on everything from finding a space and marketing yourself as a counsellor to avoiding burnout and maintaining motivation. She is also my supervisor, and today I'm speaking to her about her work in addiction. Yeah, why don't I just start off by asking you about how did you what led you to work in addiction?
Well, it was never like a lifelong dream, or I never had really experiences of anyone in addiction growing up. It was something I sort of fell into, to be honest. I After university, I did a course in dance movement therapy, and after university, I was looking at various different roles, and one of the roles that I came across was working for an organization whose parents misused substances. So, working for the children, basically, who were in known families that had addiction in them. Um, and so I would say I was sort of introduced to it there, but I suppose I was just seeing more the effects of it on the children rather than actually working directly with.
Sort of by proxy, basically.
Yeah, it was by proxy. And then I moved to a semi-secure unit with children who basically um, they were too damaged to be fostered even. And so it was effectively, I suppose, what we would know back then as a children's home. But um,
It's so,
sorry, go on.
it's so sad.
Yeah, like it was, I mean, it was a baptism of fire. It was a tough job because you're kind of parenting. You're sort of living there, you do 2 days and a night. And it was pretty intense. But again, so a lot of those children were in that place as a result of addiction. So same sort of thing where I was going, oh gosh, it was interesting actually because it kind of lined me up to then actually go and work with the people who were struggling with addiction. And that's then when I ended up working in a drug and alcohol rehab for 5 years.
Okay, wow. Okay, and I mean, God, I mean, in those 5 years, you must have seen all sorts of things and sort of come at the problem from all sorts of angles. But did you find that there were kind of common themes and kind of that in the underlying causes of addiction, whatever form that addiction took?
Yeah, I think abuse,
Hmm.
number one, every single type of abuse that you can think of. Um, I would say the common theme was there being addiction already in the family.
Right.
So
Okay.
it would be quite rare that you would meet people or they would come to rehab and there would be nothing. Even if their grandfather was an alcoholic, there was often a link in that way. And of course, then there's the whole argument of, well, is this nature or nurture? People will use the term disease for addiction, which I think is quite an interesting way of putting it. And I guess it depends as well on the angle of, are people more susceptible to it, or is it just environmental, or is it both? So yeah, I would say those would kind of be the themes. Um, but to be honest, I think pain is pain, and I think for most people, they they started to use something because they were in pain.
So as a way, as a escapism, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
escapism and knowing how to cope and we know that drugs and alcohol, depending on what drugs and alcohol you take, whether you take a stimulant or a kind of can't think of the other word, but I suppose a calming effect,
Yeah.
like heroines and your kind of tranquilizer type drugs. It changes your experience with life, it changes your relationships, it changes everything, but it does offer a momentary lapse of I don't have to face life.
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, I would say it was quite uncommon to have people that people would often say, "Oh, I had a very normal childhood," but then when you would start digging, you would you would find
Would find more.
various reasons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this idea of it being a disease, I mean, that is an interesting take. I don't know what your own take is on that.
Well, I think it's changed actually, interestingly. I think when I was there, I was in my 20s, it was an amazing experience. It was women only, it was a small unit, so there was 8 beds, and the women came back then, there was so much funding. Now, like there's just no money. So, it was a real community. Like they would cook, everything was done in group psychotherapy. So they didn't even have one-to-one counselling, actually. Everything was done in a group context. Um, and so, kind of going back to disease, I think I was young and I was quite impressionable. But actually, as I've grown, and I mean, we're sort of talking 15 years ago, I was there. As I've grown and kind of grown as a therapist myself, I think I personally wouldn't give it that title of disease. Um, I would I would say there's definitely dispositions. I would 100% agree that there are people that seem to they do seem to have more addictive personalities. They do, for whatever reason. So I'm not saying that genetics has no play, because I don't think I would be arrogant enough to say that. Um, but I think as I've kind of become more seasoned, I would say that so much of it is what people are exposed to, and and whether that be family, friends, kind of taking drugs, using alcohol, or it might be as direct at that, or as it might be just growing up in a really painful, neglectful environment, and that actually, what do we know about addiction? Things are very accessible. Alcohol is socially acceptable. And a lot of the women that came to us, actually, quite often their first addiction would actually be an eating disorder, because that would be like an accessible way of numbing their pain. And
Mhm.
then it would, we'd call it their gateway drug, and then it would progress into other things.
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder whether control, or having a sense of control over one's
yeah,
life was something that played into it, because of, I mean, eating disorders can often be kind of, bound up with having a sense of control, can't they?
absolutely. And I think the biggest thing was really, I remember, would be for because it wasn't a pure 12-step program from Alcoholics Anonymous, but we did do the steps, and the first one is admitting I'm powerless over this substance, basically. Um, so there is a complete lack of control.
Mhm.
Um, and I worked with women who they would lose their house, their family, their children. They would be prostituting themselves, you know, lost everything, and yet they would still use.
Mhm.
Um, that's the power of it. As I described it once, it's like standing in front of the tide with a mop and bucket, trying to clean
Mm.
up the sea. Do you know what I mean? It's very, very powerful, and it takes a lot of courage for people to overcome, I think.
Okay, well, talking about overcoming and and that mop and bucket, I mean, what did you discover through working in this field? I mean, in terms of the strategies for for confronting it, for tackling it.
I think that there are many routes, and I don't, as a person-centered therapist, I would say it's not one box fits all, but there definitely are some themes of things that people need to almost uh, get to in order to be able to start moving forward and start moving out of it. I personally believe that abstinence is key. Like you cannot recover from something unless you abstain from it.
Mhm.
Um, it would be often an argument, if we had, because we had people that would come in with drugs and alcohol, or just alcohol, or just drugs, and the conversations we would have again and again about, well, but drink's never been a problem for me. Like, I'm a heroin addict,
Mhm.
so what's the issue if I have a drink? And it's kind of like, well, looking at, because you're still using it to numb the pain. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not about the substance. It's never about the substance. It's about people. Addiction's about people and pain. It's not about what comes in pills and bottles. Now, obviously, you've got certain drugs that have highly addictive qualities to them and change the brain chemistry. So there is that as well. But I think I think people finding hope, people believing that they can get well. I think that is why AA is so successful, because I think it's such an isolating condition to have, as so many mental health conditions are. It's so isolating, and I think we did a lot of group work, and I think also a lot of that is about shame. The amount of shame that is around addiction is, I would say, that's like one of the number one things that people have to deal with. The other thing that people have to deal with first is denial.
Mhm.
Like, and I've sat there in rooms with women, and they're still got this belief, I can control it, I can manage it, even after they've lost everything. Like, they've got the evidence there, it's plain as day, and it's like they're blinkered. And it's really sad, because when I worked there, I'll be honest with you, the success rate was low.
Mhm.
It
Mhm.
was low. Um, we did see people recover. I did see people recover. I know people that recovered. One of my colleagues who I worked with was recovered, you know, so it's possible, but um, it definitely requires a lot of support, and a lot of grit and determination, and being willing to go to those painful places.
Okay, so we're dealing with shame, we're dealing with denial, uh, we're dealing with feeling of lack of control, we're dealing with isolation. How do we do with this as a therapist? Do you have, I mean, you were saying you work in a person-centered way. I guess that can take you a long way. Do you also kind of draw on CBT techniques or
Yeah, and actually, when we were in the rehab, it would be a host of different things. So it would be dealing with things like shame, dealing with people's pasts. And actually, interestingly, I look back at some of that, and I do think that was a there was a place for one-to-one that we didn't have, because there'd be times where we would do stuff in group and we would encourage the women to go deeper, and I look back at that and I go, actually, I think we were re-traumatizing in that moment. But again, when you're young and you're doing these things, and you've got other people there kind of going, no, this is okay, then it's like, okay, well, I trust you. So actually, now as a therapist, I would work very hard with somebody on safety first and foremost, because it's people's coping mechanisms. Like I say, it's how they cope with life, it's how they cope with pain. So if we go in there and then remove that, which obviously is what we're doing if we're going down the abstinence route, for them to have nothing to regulate, nothing to soothe.
okay.
And I don't feel like during the rehab we did enough of that. I really
Mhm.
don't. Whereas now, as a therapist, if I was working with someone, that would be it's a no-brainer. It's trauma, so that would be number one. Is
Working
like,
with trying to supply other coping mechanisms,
yeah, absolutely. And then, and again, I always used to think, well, I should work with someone once they're completely abstained. In a rehab setting, that has to happen. But I think as therapists, um, if somebody, for example, comes to you, they're alcoholic, it's a really fine line. And actually, this is where, as a therapist, you would probably look at different contracts with that person, because if someone's drinking heavily and you tell them to stop, they can actually die from that. So it's like, you don't, and this is why people need to be, if they are therapists and they are going to help someone with, say, an alcohol drug problem, like they need to be aware. They can't just sort of bumble in and expect this person to be able to just, people need to be properly detoxed, is what I'm saying. And before they came to us during rehab, they would have 2 weeks in a medical detox center. So that's really important. And I think as well, as a therapist, you would really need to like work with your supervisor about like keeping that person safe. What are the safety mechanisms? If they are still using and drinking, what happens if they turn up and they're too intoxicated? I would have a contract with them saying if I felt that or that was the case, then we would have to cancel the session, or I would have to say, like, if they could, and again, this is something you would work with your client on, but can you abstain the night before if we've got a session at 10 o'clock the next day?
Okay, so breaking it down almost into manageable little chunks of
Basically, yeah, yeah. But again, I think that's why therapists, I wouldn't ever suggest that someone would just work with someone who had addiction, because if they don't know that and they just, like I say, they just remove everything without any support, you are going to make that situation worse and potentially inhibit that person's healing rather than helping.
Okay, so almost your first go-to would be to try and kind of give them that sense of safety through other means, and think what feels safe for you, because I guess it's going to be different for everybody. What makes them feel safe? So
Yeah, absolutely.
people, it
Yeah.
might be like something like working with a safe place
Mhm.
technique. For somebody else, it might be grounding and breathing exercises, I guess.
Yeah, and then looking at like who's in their life, really kind of understanding their social kind of context. Unfortunately, people that are in addiction, often chaos surrounds that. So, it can be really challenging. And if I'm really honest, it's not that I'm against therapists working one-to-one with people in addiction, but I would actually, if I chose to take somebody on, I would be saying I would be encouraging them to do that in conjunction with other people, whether that's going to their doctors and being put on a community program of some sort, whether that's going to AA, NA, um, all the A's. There's so many of them, but like I think um, people need a lot of support. And one of the things I would say, if you're working one to one, and the responsibility, and I've had this myself, I've seen this with colleagues that I've supervised, where if you become that, almost that person to them, it's weighty. If they haven't got out other, even one other person or AA or a group of some description, like, and often because they're so vulnerable, they will, it's a very manipulative condition. Um, and so therefore you can find yourself being manipulated very easily. So again, it's having an understanding of that, and also knowing that people will lie. You know, it's the same with eating disorders. Have you eaten today? Oh yeah, I had my breakfast. And
What do you
then,
do with that? Once they've said that to you,
sorry.
once they've said that to you, what can you do? You kind of have
Right.
to trust, don't you?
And I think that is one of the key things, is kind of going, well, as a therapist, what are my limitations? What can I offer? But what can I not definitely offer?
Mhm.
I'm not a crisis helpline. I cannot pick up the phone. I had one person who called me and they were really drunk. And I just said to them, I know I can hear that you're drunk. I'm not having this conversation with you now. I will contact you tomorrow. Um, or I think I moved their session up a little bit further. Um, but boundaries, boundaries, boundaries when it comes to addiction, because it's chaotic and it's unmanageable, and people's lives are generally unmanageable. So,
Okay.
as a therapist, I think it's super important that we make sure we have the right support. But also, like I say, checking in with what has that person got other than you.
Okay. Okay. So if we're talking about kind of the obstacles to recovery from addiction, do you think that that kind of tendency to manipulate because of, how manipulative the condition itself, tendency to lie, the tendency to cross boundaries, do you think those are kind of the main obstacles?
There's some of the main obstacles. I think denial is the biggest obstacle. I really do. I've been bowled over by the way that some people deny, and that's where I do wonder if it really is that change of chemical in the brain, because it's almost like it's like a rock hard shell sometimes that you can't get through. And it's sneaky because it will lure them back. It's so seductive because it actually becomes it's like it becomes a person. It's like and I've heard addiction described like that. Like it's like it becomes a person, and that person is, when they're sober, they are so different to when they've taken something. Um, but it's not just the intoxication, it's the manipulation, it's the lying, it's the shame, it's the hiding of things, because of the fear of what will happen to me if I don't have this. And for a lot of people with addiction, actually what they've realized is that they have very, very low distress tolerance. So that would be another thing that I would actually suggest therapists to look at is, what does it mean to increase their levels of being able to tolerate feelings? When you work with addicts, their feelings are like the ultimate no-no. And in the rehab, we'd have a check-in every day where they would have to identify how they felt.
Okay.
Um,
So it's almost gradually exposing themselves to their own
yeah,
things and ramping
yeah, like
that.
yeah, we'd have like feelings like posters on the wall with different categories, and they'd all sort of stare at them, and they wouldn't be allowed to say things like "I'm okay" or "I'm
They had to.
fine." I think if they did say they were fine, there was an acronym that went with that, which I won't share because it's got the F word in it. But they wouldn't be allowed to use such words. So a lot of what you do as well is emotional intelligence, and then learning to tolerate. How do I tolerate my feelings? How do I tolerate my pain without needing to fix it, numb it?
Hmm.
You know,
One thing that I remember from a supervision with you was you drawing this picture, because we were discussing addiction at the time, you drawing this picture of a tree,
yes,
and run me through this, how this works. Every branch was like a different kind of addiction that you could have, so one branch you would have whatever alcoholism, another one is drugs, another one smoking, whatever. I guess you could have gambling on there too.
gambling, sex, shopping, porn,
Shopping,
yeah,
you name
like
it kind of
food,
you know
yeah.
and then you said, what happens if you cut off one of the branches? you know I guess what happens is that you just hop to another branch, don't you? Or another branch grows, because
Yeah.
what's ultimately feeding it is coming from the roots. So what you want to do really with somebody who is suffering from addiction is see what is feeding it, what is coming from the roots.
Absolutely, and I think that is like, again, with all trauma, it's the coexistence of, yes, we need to look at your past and help you heal that, but we also need to look at your here and now and your thinking, because your thinking will be massively distorted. I mean, as humans, our thinking, without addiction is generally pretty distorted, but with addiction, it's even more so. It's the same as like with anxiety, that your amygdala is completely taken over and your cognitive function literally it can't do anything because you're so taken over by emotion and so I think it's definitely like twofold for people to be able to, yes, look at the roots, but then look at also the rest of the tree in going, well, what's my behavior like? What's my thinking like? And we did used to do a lot of CBT as well, relapse prevention, which would be really looking at your early signs of like idealization, because people, when it came to relapsing, and it is a relapsing condition, most people relapse, some people I think relapse sort of 5-6 times badly before they actually get into recovery. The women we were working with, they would have been through every single program out there, and really we were like the last attempt to really be able to help them heal. So yeah, sorry, I've forgotten your question. I've gone off on a
I
tangent,
don't
but
remember my question was. It's something about, I guess you have to look at what is coming up from the roots, and you're working with CBT as well to be.
DBT, I think DBT, distress tolerance, like DBT wasn't really a thing so much when again, 15 years ago. It's definitely used a lot more now for addiction. I would say probably more so than CBT, because you're really looking at that distress and how can I manage that in the
Yeah,
here and now. Um,
I guess you're looking at what need is whatever it is that you're addicted to. What need is it for meeting? You know,
Absolutely. And
you-
there's a really famous guy called what's his name? Gabor Mate. Mate? I thought I'm probably saying it wrong.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but he's worked his whole life with trauma, but addiction specifically. And he always says, I ask, what's the pain? We ask what's the pain? Because that is the root. What is the pain? Um,
Being able to know and be specific about it, not just say call it maybe pain, but have a word. Is it loneliness, I guess, or is
yeah,
it
yeah.
self-hate?
Is it abuse? Is it, stuff that you haven't dealt with? Is it loneliness, low self-esteem, social anxiety? Some people might even start drinking as a result of that, and then it gets out of hand. But one of the things I always say to people to kind of, because there's so much shame, is I will often try and say to them, actually, I know this doesn't seem like it now, but when you first started taking that drug, that pill, that bottle, that porn site, whatever it was your way of trying to look after yourself, ultimately. It was your way of trying to soothe yourself when you didn't have the right tools or the right people to help you to do that well. But unfortunately, what initially worked for you is now working against you.
So it's sort
And
of
that
de-shaming. That's part of the de-shaming, isn't it?
absolutely, yeah. I think de-shaming is like, it's a real kind of uh sort of warfare way of helping people and kind of saying like, let's bring this into the light. And
Yeah.
that's why we would ask for detail, and we would ask for, I don't know, what's your ritual before you drink or use drugs, because all of that stuff is kind of, it's shame based.
Mm.
And so we would talk about, we need to bring it into the light.
And I guess it's recognizing that there's a good intention behind it, even if the effects
There
are,
was.
if the effects are negative, it doesn't mean that there is the original intention behind it isn't a good one, because I guess it's a self-soothing intention, isn't it?
It
You know,
is. It
upping
is.
the
And yeah, and I think so many people are so ashamed. And I think that's why groups and AA and things like that help so much, because you've got other people that are standing there going, I've done that too. I've prostituted myself too. Like it's it's so important for people to feel heard and not just heard, but like understood
Mhm.
from personal experience.
Mhm.
Um,
And
yeah.
and I would, I mean, this is kind of the last thing I want to ask,
Hmm.
but I wonder how much of a part does just plain willpower play in it? You know,
Willpower has got very little to do with it. In fact, those that try on willpower alone um, will fail. I think it's a misunderstanding that you need to have more willpower. I think it's about understanding, it's having more understanding about yourself, about what the pain is. It's about having people around that you can call on in that moment so that you're not doing it alone. And I think that's where willpower is so dangerous because it's basically saying I can do this by myself. And what I would say to anybody who is suffering with addiction is you need an army. You need an army to help you with this. Don't think that you can just grit your teeth and go through it. And actually, what we would describe if somebody was doing that, we would call them a dry drunk. So, what we would actually be saying is your behaviors haven't changed, you're just hanging on by the grit of your teeth. And the likelihood is that you will relapse very soon.
and did you find
Because
it was more likely for people who went on willpower alone that there was more
yeah,
like,
willpower would be the first thing we would get rid of because the first step is I acknowledge I can't it's awful that I can't remember it because it was drummed into me, but we admit that we have become our lives have become unmanageable and we are powerless against addiction is effectively what it's saying. And to say I've got willpower, you're effectively saying I've got power. And actually, it's not, it's about surrender. And that's why higher power is involved in the 12 steps because what they're saying is I'm surrendering not responsibility to a higher power or God of your understanding, but I'm saying there's something bigger than me that I can surrender to and ask for help and pick up the phone when I want to drink, um, rather than just, you know, willpower would just suggest that you've done nothing, you've changed nothing. You're just gritting your teeth.
whereas higher power suggests that there's somebody that you can think of, you can kind of relinquish responsibility a little bit. You can put down the burden and think there's some, somebody else who's kind of got your back a little bit.
Yeah, and I think there's that, but there's also just that sense of I am powerless over this. So
Mhm.
if I'm powerless over this, I'm not relinquishing my responsibility, but what I am saying is that it's a bit like a baby, isn't it? If a baby is fairly powerless, they can't feed themselves, they can't do anything else without the care of the mother or the caregiver. And it's almost like that with addiction. It's kind of going, I cannot do this alone. I have to have help. I have to have support. And I will mess up and I probably will relapse, but I'll learn from that,
Mhm.
you know. Um, but it's like I say, for a lot of people, it it kills a lot of people. That's the reality of it. There were women in the rehab that thankfully we didn't have anyone die on site ever, but we would often hear of people that would leave and 2 weeks later fallen down the stairs, hit their head and died. Like or someone had overdosed because again their tolerance had changed and they used the same amount of drug that they were using before and their body couldn't handle it. You know,
Would you
so
say
it's
it's
not.
very like particular or more grueling work than some of the things you might do as a counselor because of
Yes.
because of this high rate of relapse because of how very dangerous it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, I wouldn't say it to put the fear of God in people. I think like people do recover and people, you know, it's a bit like when you mention suicide and self-harm, everybody gets really jumpy because it's serious and it is serious and we should take it seriously. But then it's also not being intimidated by it and being able to offer the hope that often people have lost. And I think as a role as a counsellor, sometimes that is all we do, is we sit with someone and say, I know you feel hopeless right now, but I'm going to hold that hope for you that things can change. I don't know what that's going to look like. You don't know what that's going to look like, but things can change. And I guess as therapists, we wouldn't do our jobs if we didn't believe people could change. Why would we do what we do? But yes, it's not for the faint-hearted. And I did 5 years, and obviously I sort of saw several people when I first started in private practice. But actually, I haven't worked with addiction for quite some time.
Okay. Well, you did a fair stint, didn't you?
I did, yeah, I did do a fair stint for sure. But it's wonderful. It's like anything, when you do see someone recover, when you do see someone get their life back, when you do see someone reconnecting with their children, like it's magic. It really is. And that's what makes the job worthwhile. But yeah, people have to really want to get well.
Yeah, I guess you can kind of hold their hand through it, but you can't do that for them.
No, but then you could say that with all mental health issues, really, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, But I think in addiction in particular, there's a real need to make sure that person that's recovering is taking responsibility, because often they will be in this place of victim, of like, I'm, and a lot of the times they have been victims. But victim thinking is also that, combined with denial, absolute disaster in terms of people getting well. So, but yeah, it was an interesting first 10 years of my career for sure.
Backfire, you could call it. Anna, thanks so much for talking to me
It's
about
all right. You're very welcome. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more of the same, then feel free to subscribe to our podcast or visit our YouTube channel at Kent House Counselling.